So we've all had photos that we've been really excited to share with others or on social media, only to find they haven't quite had the reaction we were hoping for. For me, I've been doing photography now for roughly 8 years and experimenting even a while before that. So let me tell you, I have made many mistakes over the years. Photography didn't really come naturally to me, especially things like composition. I had to learn the hard way, making plenty of mistakes, but I have learned a lot over the years. So what I want to do in this video is go through a lot of those mistakes that many of us do make, as well as highlight these 3 important elements that we really need to consider for absolutely any photo. What's cracking, my photography friends? I'm TKNORTH. Hope you're all doing really well. Now, this realization for me to be a little bit more intentional with my photos, spend a little bit of time studying them, has only come by, sadly, a little bit more recently for me. Like most people, for many years, I was in this cycle of simply taking a photo, looking at them quickly in Lightroom, deciding if I like them or not, editing the ones I like, and leaving the ones I didn't. Then moving back on and basically repeating the cycle. But to really learn and grow from our mistakes, there is a really simple step that we can add into this process. After looking at our photos and deciding, okay, that one didn't quite work, or I like this one, how often do we spend a little bit more time working out exactly why it didn't work, or what made this other photo more pleasing to look at? For me, this method really is the fastest and most beneficial way for us to grow and improve as photographers, and something I wish I started doing sooner. So why do our photos fail? Yes, we all know that part of photography is obviously a little bit subjective. We can't please everyone, and not everyone is going to like the same photos. However, there is some obvious truths that we can't neglect when it comes to what makes a good photo and what elements make up a good photo. The good news is that in my mind, it's actually reasonably straightforward. There's only 3 key elements that make up absolutely any photo that we need to consider. If these 3 elements are all working nicely together, we have a nice photo that is pleasing to look at. These 3 elements are our overall composition, which is basically everything in our photo, and how we choose to lay out those elements. So basically how you decide to frame up any particular image. Secondly, we have the overall light, or even weather conditions we can tie into this element. Without light, we have no photo at all. So how light works in different situations really is super important to understand. And of course, lastly, we have our subject. The more interesting our subject is, again, the more interesting our photo is. So if these 3 elements are all there and working together nicely, then the end result is going to be a pleasing photo to look at. Now, not all 3 elements need to be perfect, but the better they are and the better they're working together, the better the overall photo is going to be. To help better understand these 3 key elements, I'm going to go through and assess some of my own photos. Some of them are quite old and have quite a bit of room for improvement. Some of them are much newer and actually still have some room for improvement. So let's take a look. All right, so this first photo is a pretty recent one. I've chosen this because overall, I quite like the composition. So let's assess the composition to start with. Firstly, in the background here, we have these 2 mountains which kind of give us a similar shape. So for me, this helps frame up our image, and it draws our eye into the center of the image quite nicely. Our overall subject is this tree and this hut. So the subject itself is reasonably interesting. I quite like this hut in the snow. It's quite a nice subject. But what really makes this photo stand out is the lighting conditions. So the light in this one is really strong. We've got nice light on the trees in the background, and the sun coming through this tree is almost a subject in itself. If we go back to our composition for a minute, our subject is framed up pretty much centered. So if we consider these as a subject together, our center is right between our subject pretty much. If I was to frame one of these up more centered, I don't think I'd like the composition as much. We also have these nice shadows from the sun, which kind of almost giving a diagonal out to the corners, which again, I think just helps bring our eye into the center of the image. So overall, I like this composition. The only thing that I find probably negative about it is this hut on the left. Now, of course, I could remove this in Photoshop. I don't think it adds to the image. It's also really close to this edge. I just find it a little bit distracting. So anytime we have objects really close to our edges, for me, this is one thing I probably learned the hard way and did far too often when I was starting out. So that's one thing we can learn from. I think the other thing we can learn from this image is how we can use negative space to our advantage. So we have quite a bit of negative space down the bottom of the image and also up the top in the sky. Now, the way I've cropped this also means that our kind of horizon, or where the mountains is almost on a third, our subject is on another third, and our subject is nearly on these thirds, which again, for me, we don't always have to use things like the rule of thirds, but in some cases they can be really useful. So understanding these, knowing when to maybe use them, when not to use them, is still really useful when we're starting out. This next image is a really interesting subject. We've got Mount Fuji and the pagoda here, so a big plus on the subject matter. But for me, the overall framing and composition is really poor. I think I must have been just framing up to center Mount Fuji. You can see if I change my crop overlay, Mount Fuji is really centered in this image. If we got rid of the pagoda here and it was just a shot of clean Mount Fuji, having it centered like that, I would have really liked this frame. However, the composition here with the pagoda, we're kind of cutting off the edge. It's really close to the edge, which is a little bit distracting. And we have much more negative space on this side. So again, with two kind of main subjects like this, really they should almost be on the thirds in my opinion. So if I aimed this shot far more to the right, and if possible maybe zoomed out a little bit, I would have had a far more interesting composition. Of course, what I did to this image is actually cropped it in. So if we look here, you can see where I actually cropped it in. Now, this crop is actually a much more compelling composition. You can see we can actually really see the detail now on the pagoda. Mount Fuji really stands out as well. And just by cropping into a portrait orientation, this has really improved this image. If we look at our crop overlay, again, Mount Fuji is almost on a third there. And the pagoda, the detail here is on the other third. It's a much more interesting composition in my mind. All right, one more example from the exact same day. This is a much wider shot. It works a lot better as a landscape image because we have some negative space on the right. Again, I think I should have aimed it a little bit more to the right. So when I cropped this one, as you can see, I actually cropped it in a little bit just to make a little bit more space there on the right, but overall not a bad landscape composition. Okay, so what about portrait images? Now, for me, I started out not shooting a lot of portraits, so I always struggled with them initially. I'll tell you a few reasons I struggled. So let's start with one where I quite like the composition. So for this one, firstly, we have this line which is kind of leading our eye into the subject, which is nice. We have this line centered at the top, which again, nice framing of our overall subject. We also have, if I have a look at our crop overlay, the eyes are nicely on this third, which always works nicely. And we also have pretty much centered this eye, which is the main focus. So these are tips for portraits. Consider your thirds, consider what you're cutting out, use negative space or lines to kind of draw in your eye to the subject. Here we also have quite nice light. I actually heard a friend, Mitch Lully, if you guys know him, I'm sure some of you do. He was talking about how our eye is naturally drawn to the brightest part of the image. So this is important to consider when we shoot subjects. Often we want sunlight or our light source kind of lighting up their face in some way. So here, having our subject facing out the window, we're getting nice natural light on the face, which again helps draw our eye into the subject. So here's another example of a portrait. Now, if we look at the overall composition, I'll go back to the original photo. I honestly can't tell you what I was thinking when I took this photo. Perhaps it was by accident, or perhaps it was just a really bad shot, or maybe there was something on the left that made me kind of forced to put my frame a little bit too far to the right. But because our subject is looking to the left, the fact that all this negative space is up, above, and behind them just really makes no sense. And sometimes we can save our images like this, that when I crop it in, it's actually a way better image. Again, the eyes are kind of on this top third, which helps. Now, here's one example where you don't always need to have the sunlight directly on your subject's face, but I think one mistake I made, definitely starting out, was shooting into the sun too much. Obviously, this means your subject is going to be darker. On this occasion, it looks quite nice. We've got some sunlight hitting the hair. If we look at the before, there was still some light on the face. So if you're shooting into direct sunlight like this, or backlit portraits, they can be quite nice, but remember to experiment and try lighting up your subject a bit more as well. All right, so next image. Again, here's an example of a pretty poor composition. We have some nice detail, some nice light. So the conditions are quite good. The subject's quite interesting. It tells a bit of a street scene in Japan. Again, if we look at the overall crop though, I've cropped it in a little bit here, but you can see the car's cut off. I don't know what I was thinking. This was on a 70 to 200. So what I really should have done here is zoom out a little bit, but if I didn't crop the edge of this car out, it just would have helped the overall photo a lot more. I think that's a pretty obvious one that you probably don't need me to tell you. So if I shot this a little bit wider, didn't have the taxi so close to the edge, again, it would have been a much nicer image. All right, here's another old one, I think from 2018. This is another street shot. This composition I actually really like. So the way the subject is framed up with the gate in the background here is really nice. And again, just kind of in a way complements our subject. We have really nice light in the background, and there's still a bit of light on our subject's face. So overall, pretty strong composition. Maybe our subject's just creeping a little bit too close to the bottom here. If I was somehow able to get a bit lower, bring our subject up a bit higher, still get this framing in the background, again, I think this would have been even better. So our next image here is again a nice kind of wide landscape, and a really nice one for providing a bit of scale. Again, our subject on this one is pretty much on the rule of thirds grid. So any of these intersection points is essentially where we're using our rule of thirds. So this is an example of that. It's quite nice because our subject is also looking down and to the left, which is down into this negative space. Now, the only thing I find a little bit distracting about this one, this rock at the top is quite interesting in how it kind of frames up our image. I probably would like it a little bit more if it was maybe a little bit more off to the left and not so big in the image. And also perhaps if I could get a bit lower and move to the right, we get a little bit better view of the mountains in the background as well. And this rock could still frame it up nicely, but not be as obvious in our image. So overall, reasonably strong composition, reasonably nice light that I've actually increased a bit in post there. And overall, our subject is really interesting. So our subject is actually Pat K in this one, if any of you guys are familiar with him. Now, there's not much happening behind Pat in this image. Obviously, it's just rock. So anything like this, where our subject is looking out to the view, visually, this is going to be a lot more compelling if they're looking the wrong way, looking back into our image. And we usually want them to be looking where there's more space in the photo, because this is where our eye's going to be drawn in. Once we look at the subject, we look more out to the left and see the view. That's why if we could see more of this mountain in the background, perhaps it would be a more interesting composition. But overall, I quite like this image. All right, so again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but here's an example where our subject, because they're looking to the right where there's not much space, it just doesn't make as much sense to me. Although they're getting nice light on them, if they were looking out to the left, this just would have improved this photo a lot in my opinion. So here we have kind of an interesting detailed shot of the sign, reflection, little bit going on in this one. It's not a perfect composition, but if we go back to our original photo, you can see the original composition, again, I don't really know what I was doing here. We've got this down in the bottom, kind of middle, and this part of the image should really be our focus. So if we crop that in 4:5, it helps because it just brings our sign a little bit closer to the top. Really interesting subject that was really poorly shot. So here's an example of shooting again into sunlight, a backlit portrait, which again, I shoot far too many of. Especially when I was starting out, I think coming more from landscape photography, I used to think you always need to shoot to where the sky looks nice, where it's kind of colorful, where the sun's coming from in some ways. So I used to always shoot portraits like this far too much, not think about how the lighting would affect their face, and thinking about that our subject is in dark shadow. So some of these elements still can be a little bit subjective, especially things like subject matter, but I hope you did find this video useful. Remember to subscribe if you did. Let's all go out and be a little bit more intentional when we're taking our photos. Keep on creating and keep on growing, my friends. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.